a warm welcome from my side. Thank you, Vinod, for introducing me. We are running the Climate Justice Office. And so I would like to say why we are having these online dialogues today. First of all, I would like to mention our important conference, which we held exactly 1 year ago on the 18th, 19th of September. So it's our 1 year anniversary. You will find the climate, the conference, which was of course on climate-induced migration, in the chat box in a few seconds. And also to mention again, please use the chat box for exchanging links which you find useful. Please check this link out. We worked in this conference on the Manila Initiative, which is still very important and valid to look through and we should discuss further. And also you will find wonderful animation and lots of other resources. Hopefully also we will document, or not hopefully, definitely will document some of our discussions there on the website. So again, please check it out. The topic was and is important for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation because we have a dilemma here. Everyone is talking about or recognizes at least the importance of climate rights, but it's a little bit, you can call it like, or we call it like an orphan issue. So there are no international standards in place and implemented, despite the fact that the situation, especially under COVID now, is worsening. So we have some institutions and places where it is discussed. For example, the UNFCCC negotiations around the loss and damage discussion caused by the impacts of climate change, but the discussion actually is a little bit stuck on the money discussions. Who's going to pay to whom and actually how much? Then there is a global compact on refugee. The problem here is people are displaced by climate change, fall not really into the category of refugees, as for example, people fleeing from political persecution. Then there is the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. It recognizes at least climate change as a driver of migration, but it is mandated to protect the rights of those displaced and address the root economic, environmental, social drivers that compel people to leave their communities and countries. So there is something, but the question remains is that does that provide enough space for discussion, negotiations on the rights of climate migrants to eventually actually also put them in place? So there is still a lot of work to do, and this is actually why we're having this dialogue series. This is one of the first series we start with. I will say a little bit more later on, and therefore I wish us all a very fruitful discussion. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Laura. And thanks for giving this brief background of how we are trying to organize this climate dialogue series on climate migrants. And also that this is the first anniversary of the Manila conference where we had a 3-day discussion and field visits, and we came out with a document called Manila Declaration. And as we all know that the climate migrants were already facing the brunt of the extreme climate events and displacement, and now their challenges have been further aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Last year already, within a year, we had 25 million people who were displaced worldwide due to the climate and weather-related disasters. And within 1 year only, there were more than 1900 extreme climate events. And this year, the world is grappling with an upsurge in the coronavirus infections. The problem is that the issue of climate migrants, they fall through the cracks of the international refugee and immigration policy. The mass displacement of the communities are generally approached as a humanitarian issue, and which are responded only when there is a crisis or emergency or a disaster. But gradually we see a slow change in this understanding, and it is being increasingly recognized that the effects of climate change, obviously in combination with other factors, are going to increase the number of the displacement and migration of the people. We also have Global Compact for Migration, for example, which recognizes climate change as a driver of the migration. And the GCM is mandated to protect the rights of these displaced and to help address the root economic, environmental, and social drivers that compel people to leave their communities and countries. Given this as the background, we are organizing this dialogue to make sure that the rights of the climate migrants are not locked out during this pandemic situation. And at the same time, we also call for international solidarity and actions in the support of the climate migrants. Let us all use this platform to collect our ideas and thoughts and share them with each other using chat options in Zoom or in Facebook. We will be closely monitoring both the Facebook pages also. And we value your suggestions and we look forward to your active participation in this dialogue. Without any further delay, I would now welcome our eminent panelists and speakers. It is my pleasure to share that our panelists come from diverse and different backgrounds, and they bring with them their vast pool of experience and expertise in the field of climate change and migration. The first in the panel is Pia Oberoi. Ms. Pia is a senior advisor on migration and human rights at the Southeast Asia Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. She is responsible for developing and implementing research and policy on migration and human rights in the region. Pia previously headed the migration team at the UNHR in Geneva, and before that, she headed the migrants' rights work at Amnesty International. She is currently based in Bangkok, Thailand. Along with her, we have Harjeet Singh. Harjeet is the global lead on the climate change for Action Aid and is based in New Delhi in India. He supports countries across the world on climate change policy and advocacy. Prior to this, he managed disaster resilience program globally and coordinated emergency response and preparedness work in Asia and Americas. Until 2007, Harjeet headed the tsunami response program in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands for Action Aid in India. I'm happy to introduce Annie Lestari and the Annie Adi. Annie founded the Association of Indonesian Migrant Workers and is currently the chairperson of the International Migrants Alliance. She became an advocate for migrant rights after being mistreated by her first employer when she was working as an Indonesian domestic worker in Hong Kong. She now strives to create an inclusive society for migrant workers to enjoy, so that they enjoy equal respect and opportunities in the society. In 2016, she was invited to speak at the opening ceremony of the first UN Summit for Refugees and Migrants. We also have with us today Aaron Cedaroy. Aaron heads the Asia Pacific Mission for Migrants, which is a regional institution supporting migrants' empowerment and movement building through advocacy, education, and organizing. He went to Hong Kong more than 2 decades ago to be part of the regional secretariat of the Asian Students Association. It was his integration with the migrant community and his understanding of their situation and the root causes of migration that got him involved with the Asia Pacific Mission for Migrants. I sincerely thank all the panelists who accepted our invitation to be part of this endeavor. I will now ask Pia Oberoi to shed some light on the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. what does it say about climate migrants, and what do you think are the challenges and steps promoted towards the protection of climate migrants in the time of pandemic? Pia, over to you.
Thank you very much. And you will be showing my presentation on the screen. But before that, I would like to thank you very much, Vinod, and to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for inviting me to this really, I'm sure, going to be very interesting discussion, and also to share the virtual stage with the eminent fellow panelists. Very much looking forward to the discussion today. So maybe, I know we don't have a lot of time, so maybe we can go to the next slide. And even actually the slide after that. So as Vinod said, what I'd like to talk about is a little bit more about the Global Compact for Migration and some of the challenges associated with climate migrants, but also how this framework might be able to provide some protection. So in the next slide, we'll actually start with the New York Declaration. And of course, Eni is very familiar with this, having spoken at the 2016 meeting. But this was a declaration that essentially started the move towards the two global compacts. And interestingly, in this declaration, it recognized that people move because of the adverse effects of climate change and natural disasters or other environmental factors. And it recognized that people move for a combination of reasons. And I think that was very important to have that particular first understanding of the climate and environment in the context of mobility. So in the next slide, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, thank you, yes, that's right, was endorsed by the General Assembly in December 2018. So from the New York Declaration, there was then a 2-year process of consultation and discussion. I'm sure some of you might have been involved in the various different consultative processes to put together this framework. It's not a binding document, it's a framework, but it has been endorsed by the vast majority of UN member states, and it was endorsed by the General Assembly in December 2018. It is premised on international law and standards, and there's a very clear link in the framework to international law, including international human rights law. It's also very clearly linked to the SDG framework, and so it has, a strong link with the development agenda. It has 23 objectives, which are quite comprehensive, and it has what it calls a 360-degree vision of migration. And this is important as well, because in the past, as has been hinted at, there was very much a bifurcated idea that there's either a humanitarian approach or there's a security approach, which many governments would prefer. There's a rights approach, but none of them can somehow mix together. So you're either talking about labor migration or you're talking about refugees. And you've got these people at very opposite ends of the spectrum. One of the key innovations of the GCM, and I'll go through it in a little bit of detail in a second, has been the comprehensive inclusion of natural disaster and climate change, and understanding these two phenomena that we're talking about as a driver of contemporary migration. So if we go to the next slide, to the first of the two objectives that speaks to climate change and environmental degradation, is Objective 2, which commits states to minimize the adverse drivers and structural factors that compel people to leave their country of origin. And I think that's important to note, that it talks about a compulsion to leave. So yes, Lara was right to say that the refugee framework does not recognize people that are fleeing climate within its legal framework. But the Global Compact is saying that these people aren't leaving voluntarily. So there has to be some sort of an international protection response. It calls on states to better map, understand, predict, and address migration movements, and to ensure the human rights of migrants. And particularly calls on states to address the vulnerabilities of persons affected by both sudden onset and slow onset natural disasters. And I'll come to some of these concepts in a minute. But if we go on to the next slide to look at Objective 5, which is the other objective in the Global Compact that speaks specifically to the issue of climate. So Objective 5 calls on states to enhance the availability and flexibility of pathways for regular migration. So now it's looking at what is a solution to the problem, the driver that we've already identified. And it talks about developing or building on existing national and regional practices for admission and stay. So, visa regimes and ways in which governments can respond to the fact that migrants are compelled to leave their countries of origin, again, due to sudden onset natural disasters. And it provides some sense in humanitarian visas, private sponsorships, education visas, temporary work permits, when adaptation in or return to their country of origin is not possible. And before I kind of leave the context of the Global Compact, I also wanted to talk a bit about Objective 7, which is the next slide, and to think a little bit about vulnerability, because the Global Compact reflects a little bit about migrants in situations of vulnerability or vulnerable situations. And in its Objective 7, which is specifically on vulnerability, it commits states to respond to the needs of migrants who face these situations of vulnerability. And it talks about how this comes about. So it's about the circumstances that they face in their countries of origin, transit, or destination, or in how they travel. And I think when we start to, and as you all know, and as my fellow panelists will provide much more detail on, I'm sure, the way in which migrants who experience climate and the environment, the adverse effects of these phenomenon, the way that they experience them is quite complex and multifaceted. And so understanding vulnerability is an important part of responding. And there you'll see some guidelines, principles and guidelines that OHCHR, the UN Human Rights Office, as well as UN partners, put together in 2018, which I essentially kind of guides to governments but other stakeholders in understanding and addressing this kind of vulnerability. So if we go to the next slide, really, I just wanted to spend a minute on how the climate and the environment interacts with mobility. And I will go quickly because I'm sure the other panelists will also address this. But I talked a bit about the multi-causality of human mobility in the context of climate change. So it's very hard to say, which is why the refugee framework, doesn't kind of embrace so easily climate change, because it's multi-causal. Sudden onset disasters are, of course, easier to identify as drivers of movement. Slower onset processes tend to result in kind of longer term, more protracted displacement. And of course, we'll see, when we talk about the Global Compact for migration, we're talking about international migration. We're talking about people that cross borders. But of course, we know that most of the people that are displaced, migrate in the context of climate change and environment, move internally. And others indeed are rendered immobile. So some people are in fact unable to move, even if moving would be the solution that they would look for. So, we have climate as a driver of movement from the country of origin. We have the impacts of climate change exacerbate their vulnerability in transit. There's a disproportionate impact of migrants in vulnerable situations. And there's a risk factor for migrants in the context of entry. And there I just wanted very quickly to talk about, or to mention, the Human Rights Committee judgment of earlier this year, which in the context of New Zealand and Kiribati, actually specifically mentions that people might in fact have a ground to stay and be protected from return. And for the next slide, very, very quickly, because I know I am running out of time, the impact of the pandemic on climate migrants. And I won't spend too much time on it, and I'm sure this slide will be available to you. All of which to say, the takeaway for me is that the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing vulnerabilities. So it has further eroded reliance, it has exacerbated structural challenges. And in the region, we have, these challenges are plentiful, and about it, the lack of regular mobility pathways, criminalization of regular migration, this reliance on very flexible and temporary programs and unregulated corridors and unprotected migrants that move. So the people that are going to be worst affected by climate change are also those that are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And this is going to be, a worry kind of going forward in the context of sudden onset weather disasters, for instance. There would be potential concerns if this pandemic, continues, and we don't know how long it will go, but potential concerns about movement restrictions or relocations. If you're evacuating people, how do you ensure that they're protected from infection? But more broadly, as I said, I think we need to look at pre-existing vulnerabilities and understand how migration governments needs to change to understand and respond to how the pandemic is affected migrants in terms of border closures or forced return, restrictions of freedom of movement. So to go to my last slide, I just wanted to give you a sense of, well, what is coming up? What can we do, particularly in relation to the Global Compact for migration? There will be a regional review, the first opportunity that we have to measure progress of the member states against this quite comprehensive framework is coming up early next year. There will be a series of civil society or stakeholder consultations will be held later this year. I'm going to finish. I know I've heard the bell. It would just give me there will be a series of stakeholder consultations, which you're very warmly encouraged to participate in. There will be an intergovernmental meeting in March next year, and governments are already filling out voluntary national surveys. We'd encourage you to contact your governments and be part of them. The objectives really are to build the body of knowledge, to understand where the gaps are, to understand where the challenges are, but also to think about recommendations for how we fill these gaps. Does your government, for instance, have a national plan of action, which includes the climate and environment for implementing the Global Compact for migration? So I'm going to leave it there, but of course, I'm very happy to answer questions. And thank you again very much for inviting me to this discussion.
Thank you, Pia. That was very nicely put in a very brief time. And before going to the next panelist, I would request our participants to put their valuable contributions, comments, and suggestions in the chat section. And if you want to ask any question to the speakers, please do not forget to mention whom it is directed to. And we really look forward to your contributions in the chat sections. Harjeet ji, we see that climate crisis is not on a pandemic break. Just as when almost every country in the world is grappling with the upsurge of coronavirus infections, we see the climate crisis is further intensifying. We also see that the large number of peoples are being displaced. So, Harjeet, how do you think the recent disasters and pandemic have further worsened the situation of the climate migrants? And how do you see the governments and the international community is responding to these situations? Harjeet.
Thank you, Vinod, and thanks, Tetet and the entire Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for inviting me for this very, very important and interesting session. And we all engage and work together at UNFCCC to influence negotiations on this very topic. And you are absolutely right, Vinod, when you say that it is not, climate crisis is not taking a break, as the whole world is grappling with COVID crisis. If you go to the next slide, this infographic, which I found somewhere, actually illustrates how. Can you go to the next slide, please? If you make it full screen, probably it will be better. Yeah, just make it full screen. From view, go to view and make full screen. Make it full screen, probably that will be better. Okay. No, there's no option. It's fine. So as you can see, while we are dealing with COVID, which is an immediate crisis, but we've already started seeing how economies are beginning to face recession, and the climate change is coming to us as a much, much bigger crisis. And sitting in this part of the world, we've already seen massive floods, and we were hit by cyclone in this region, but particularly Bangladesh and India. And Bangladesh has seen unprecedented floods, and we are also seeing many states in India flooded, and the whole world is witnessing a crisis fueled by climate change. Let's also look at the wildfires that the Americas is dealing with at this very moment. So definitely COVID has made things worse particularly for poor communities. And as Pia was saying, we have seen people who are already vulnerable are the ones who are facing these impacts much more and have very little capacity to deal with the situation. Next slide, please. So this is just to illustrate that how we are living in a 1 degree warmer world, and this infographic is drawn from IPCC report that came out in 2018, which clearly says that if we cross that 1 degree threshold, which unfortunately we are, and if we move towards a 1.5 degree warmer world, it's already going to be pretty bad. And the political target that we have as part of Paris Agreement is going to make it so much worse. You know, you talk of extreme heat between 1.5 to 2 degree, it's going to make it 2.6 times worse. Similarly, you look at decline in annual catch of marine fisheries or species loss. You know, it's 2 to even 10 times much more impact if you look at sea level rise and if you look at how glacial melt is increasing. So, you know, just 0.5 degree of warming is going to play so much of havoc. And we have already seen all the impacts that we are seeing here are because of 1 degree. And there's a direct relationship between increasing impacts and communities being displaced, whether it is due to crop loss or extreme heat or, you know, livelihood sources really drying up. Next slide, please. So number of impacts that we see because of climate change. This infographic comes from UNFCCC, and you can see slow onset and extreme weather events here. I'm sure we all are aware of drought and tropical cyclones, but what we don't necessarily talk about are ocean acidification. We don't talk much more about loss of biodiversity. Imagine wildfires are not even there on this infographic because this is a 3-year-old infographic. So glacier melt and the multiplier impacts that we are going to see because of that, and number of people who are going to get displaced, we still don't talk enough about it. At the bottom of the slide, you also see some icons which talk about various kinds of economic and so-called non-economic losses. Just go slightly up and you'll be able to see when it comes to economic, we talk about loss of business operations and agriculture production going down. But when it comes to non-economic losses, which we are actually advocating for the name change, loss of life, loss of health, human mobility, loss of territory, loss of cultural heritage. Imagine these kind of impacts which the whole world is not even ready to understand. So really we are moving towards a very, very complex situation where governments do not really have capacity to even recognize some of these challenges. Next slide, please. And some of the reports that came up just last year, how sea level rise is going to displace many more people, 3 times more people who are living on the coast. And that was very shocking because every other report that's coming after even the recent IPCC report is painting a much more grimmer picture of many, many people being displaced and will be forced to leave their homes. Next slide, please. This is the latest number, slightly up, please, from IDMC, Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. As we speak in 2019, there were 50 million people who were displaced. And the figure that you see on your screen, 33.4 million people were new displacements in 2019. And out of that, 24.9, which is more than 90% displacements were due to disasters. And out of 24.9, sorry, 90% of them are weather related. So you can clearly see now numbers are in front of us, what role climate change is playing when you look at the overall displacement and migration that we are seeing because of that. And within weather, you can see 13 million from storms and cyclones and floods. So really, the numbers are growing and we really do not have enough systems in place to support these people. Next slide, please. As I'm supposed to speak much more about Asia, look at all these reports. Out of 5 countries who have seen most displacements, 4 are in Asia. Next slide, please. And within South Asia, you see India, Bangladesh have massive numbers, particularly because of weather-related disasters. It's only Afghanistan which faces a conflict situation where you see conflict numbers are more. But most of the displacement that are happening in the region are disaster, are climate related. Next slide, please. So as ActionAid, we have been working with various partners to look at the whole issue of climate migration. The report on your left, Climate Change Knows No Borders, that came out in 2016. And in May this year, we came up with a report that looks at migration and how COVID has made things much more difficult. Next slide, please. So very quickly getting into issues, although PR did touch upon, how climate change has become one of the critical drivers. We still talk much more about fast onset events or extreme weather events, but there are also a number of slow onset events which are displacing millions. And we really need to be looking into that. And a lot depends on economic and social factors. Again, if people are much more poorer or socially excluded, they are going to be the ones who will face these situations much more. Next slide. Similarly, a lot depends on scale. The way emissions are increasing, population growth, distribution, and now if I put the COVID lens, how the economic situation is going to drive people more and more. And we've also seen that the extreme onset events, they cause a dramatic kind of mass displacement. But then people also undergo routine migration, and then there's also permanent migration due to slow onset events. I think that's where, when we respond, we need to make that distinction on the typology of migration that we are seeing. Although we have seen most of the people who migrate, they go for short to medium term. Next slide. So we have also seen where these communities land up in large urban slums, which often lack basic services. And we have seen how women, children, elderly, and persons with disabilities are the ones facing much more challenges. While we talk of displaced people, we also, do I have 2 minutes?
Harjeet, please, if you can wind up in 1 minute.
Okay, I'll try and do that. So while we talk about displaced people, we also need to look at how people who are trapped, again, Pia talked about it, she talked about it in the reference of people crossing borders, but that's also true. There are some people who can't even leave their village or town. So they are absolutely trapped. Next slide. So very quickly, migration is not a new issue. We have seen push and pull factors, which I just talked about. Our governments have been very slow to recognize, and the issue has been largely invisible. Although COVID has really exposed how big the reality is, how people leave their homes to migrate, and how they lack social protection, both at source as well as destination. Next slide. I think I've already highlighted this one, so I'll skip and I'll rather talk about the recommendations. Just keep going. I think just go to the previous slide. I mean, I'm sure we have seen all these pictures, but coming from India, we have seen some dramatic pictures of how people were forced to migrate in COVID situation. So very quickly, just give me 30 seconds. So in terms of national level, national governments have been very slow to recognize the whole issue. And I think that's something which is very important for us as civil society to make sure that governments begin to recognize. Again, COVID has played some role, but our governments tend to forget very slowly, very quickly. So we need to continue to remind that how they have to uphold rights and dignity of people who are affected, and how social protection is important for vulnerable communities, and particularly women. Why women? Because we've also seen how their care work increases in such situation. At the regional level, when people are forced to cross borders, again, speaking of many countries in Asia, it is not yet recognized. Although when you start talking to countries, you find that there are more commonalities among countries in terms of these challenges, but the political recognition is not there. And there's a lot of cooperation that can happen, in terms of how they can develop common policies and codes and responses, but that even exchange is not happening. And then people who are forced to cross borders, most of them really stay in their own region. And there is no regional framework that can help them and provide legal protection. Next and the last slide. At the international level, again, Pia talked about Global Compact, and there's a lot more happening at UNFCCC under loss and damage. As Vinod was talking about, there's a task force for displacement. There's also a global forum outside, which brings different stakeholders together. But all these really need to come together and help countries and governments who also need financial support. While we can keep talking about policy frameworks in these countries, but we also need to provide them support. And there's also a gap in terms of research, in terms of definition and conceptual understanding. Again, civil society can play a very important role. And for us as international organizations, including labor unions, and again, the role of labor union had become even more important when we have seen how COVID has displaced millions of workers and they have no social protection. So really emphasizing on how these communities can be protected both at source and destination. And I'm also pleased to share that ActionAid is working closely with Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung on the whole issue of social protection, and will be coming out reports later this year. So, and that will also link with communities who are facing migration. That's from me for now. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for making so important points. And I'm sure in the next round, we will get some solid suggestions from you on how to build our alliance also to protect the rights of the climate migrants, Harjeet. And to the participants, I would request that it would be great if you can further highlight the situation of the climate migrants in your regions, in our area, and please use the chat options to make your comments and contributions. Moving on to the next panelist, Annie Lestari. Annie, how do you explain the link between those who migrate for labor or employment purposes and those who are displaced by the climate events or climate change impacts? What kind of challenges and issues are faced by the climate migrants in destination countries? So, Annie, over to you.
Thank you, Vinod. I have a PowerPoint to share my highlight for tonight. So, I would like to share about the situation and challenges that faced by migrants and refugees. That will include also climate migrants and refugee. Next. So let me just begin that without counting the climate migrant, the so-called climate migrants, though for me, I don't usually distinguish, the number of currently the number of the migrants that will fall into temporary and also semi-temporary, semi-permanent, it reached to 260 million people according to the United Nations. And 40% of them, 60% of them fall into what we call as a temporary migrants. So that means this is the number of people who are working as a temporary migrants, as construction, domestic worker, caregiver, and other type of sector. And then on top of that, there are also 65 million who fall under the category of refugee, asylum seeker, and displaced people. So if you add into the number of the people displaced by climate change, practically you can see the whole population is so big. It is even bigger than Indonesia, is the fourth largest nation in the world. So this is actually quite worrying. And then yet, what we see decades by decades, the number of people forced to migrate are actually continuing, are actually increasing. So the question is, where are these people going to go in the future? If there is seems no country that we can actually even settle in that permanent basis. So what I would like to explain is what are really the differences or perhaps similarities between people who are forced to migrate by poverty and the rest, and people who are forced to migrate by climate. First is climate migrants are part of the vast number of displaced people in the world. So as I mentioned to you, many of us who are forced to migrate by force simply because we are actually impoverished, by the transnational corporation who are taking away our lands, and slowly even people who just fall into a poverty line, they will move to the city, and then when they cannot find job, they will move abroad. So climate migrants and refugee is not different, because even before they think of migrating across the border, they actually try to live within the country. They try to find nearby area where they can sustain their family and finding a job. But when they can't do that, and the government do not even support them, do not even create a very conducive environment so they can settle in the good situation, then they are forced to live abroad so they can look for a better income, better conditions, so they can rebuild again their houses. So so that's the similarities. And also practically in IMA, we categorize people who are forced to move out by three major reasons. One is really poverty, second is war and political conflict, and the last is the climate change. So practically, these three categories are the major reason why now we become population of migrants and refugees abroad. The second is really the climate migrants have become part of the whole community of foreign workers in the countries where they move to. So when we are abroad, regardless why you are migrating, whether it's because poverty, climate, or even sometimes because of the political conflict, in the end of the day, all of us are actually cheap labor who are working in service sector. We do the 3D job, dirty, difficult, and danger. We receive very low pay, and we have very insecure employment, lack of access to social services. And then all of us will fall into second or third category of citizen. That's why we are people who are very invisible. And then socially, we are excluded from any type of basic entitlement. It is lucky enough if you are being protected by certain policy and laws, but majority of us are not. And then yet, whenever there is crisis, including like now, when there is COVID-19, we are used by a government, right-wing political parties to even scapegoat us to cover up, their failure to within their own system. So we are stigmatized, we are arrested, and even our right to union is also being denied. So the next one. So what are the challenges and issues confronting migrants across the world today? First, regardless again on why you migrate, all of us are suffering from health crisis. Many of the migrants are also infected by COVID-19. We also face that, especially those in the frontliner. In time when there is lockdown, people don't go out. Migrants are still there, out there, in the factories, in the domestic care, and even on the street, cleaning places to perform our duties. And then yet many of us also died because the labor camp provided by companies and by government are so dense and very cramped. So the infection become very, very vigorous. And then we are also being denied in terms of protection tools such as mask, sanitizer, and others. We are facing a psychological stress, and also even people are suffering from hunger. Next. So economic consequences that we are suffering: termination, unpaid leave, denial of job application, deterioration of our labor rights, exclusion from any relief program, while the government in host country are giving away cash and any type of relief to their people. We are excluded, whether you are a refugee, whether you are migrants, including the climate migrants. And also we are suffering financial stress because we have to buy our own expenses. Why? Because government do not buy anything, do not even provide us with any means. We also suffer from lack of health services, especially government only provide those with a legal status, but when you are in temporary and undocumented status, you practically are not given anything. And then no subsidy by our own government whenever we lose the job and we are being deported. And lastly, about the political consequences that we are suffering now, lack of information, mainly in English and even in the national language. So many of the migrants don't understand what is this COVID about, how to prevent it, and what are the new policies of that immigration or government that we have to follow. Many of us do not even understand, yet we will be arrested if we break anything. We also face a crackdown, arrest, and deportation. Our democratic spaces are shrinking. Many governments do not want to listen or even meet with migrant representation anymore. We also suffer discrimination, xenophobia. Many of us stranded and even detained. So this are the challenges that regardless of our, whether we are climate migrants, economic migrants, or even refugee are suffering the common issues. Thank you. And the way forward, lastly, I'm sorry, just 30 minutes. We really have to address the short-term issues of migrants, which is information. We need a relief program. We need legal assistance and even safe repatriation. But in the long run, we have to ask accountability from our own government, from the host government, to ensure that we will be treated equally like others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annie. That was a very nice sharing and perfect representation of the issues and challenges faced by the climate migrants. And I think I will pose this question to all our participants also, to suggest how the global justice movements can support the rights of the climate migrants. We want to make it as a kind of contributory dialogue. So dialogue means that both sides should contribute. There is nobody as audience. Everybody is trying to contribute to a cause. So, and second request is, again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or in the Q&A section, either in Zoom or in the Facebook also. And now I will request Aaron to share his views. Do you think, Aaron, that climate migrants' rights is an orphan issue in the intergovernmental negotiations? What are the lessons learned insofar as advocating for the climate migrants' rights in the intergovernmental spaces? Aaron, you have approximately 7-8 minutes.
Hey. Thank you very much, Vinod, and thank you to the RLS for initiating this activity, and all other partners of RLS for the invitation to share our thoughts in this activity, and for continuing the conversation that was started last year with regards to the question of is it important for climate migrants to be involved in intergovernmental spaces? Of course it is, and the question is right now that we should measure is how really apparent is the involvement of climate migrants in these intergovernmental spaces. But we have to look at it also in the general picture of how open really are intergovernmental spaces to migrants in general. So the lessons that we are going to present here with regards to engagement in international governmental spaces are based on the principles of the Asia-Pacific Mission for Migrants, and based on the continuing practice that we have with this kind of work. There are many things that can be said about this, but let me just focus on 4 points. Next slide, please. The first point that we realized in engagement is that migrants are really the most important of the stakeholders. They are not mere spectators, but are active actors in these engagements. They are the ones to experience how policies manifest in reality. They are the first to experience the drivers of migration, like what has been said by Pia and even by Harjeet and Annie. They are the ones who get trafficked, whether it's through legal or illegal means. They are the ones who pay the fees charged by governments or the private sector. They know if laws exist or are enforced to empower them or make them more vulnerable. And they could discern the difference between being treated as a human being or as a slave or as a commodity. The issue of migration or forced displacement due to multiple causes, including climate change, is not foreign to migrants. We have to, and I'm very glad Annie was here actually to present on the situation of migrants right now under the COVID-19 pandemic. We have to recognize that migrants are actually the experts on the issue and problems of migration. And in this aspect, we try to make it a point in every conversation, in every engagement, to raise that we must also respect not only the so-called expert studies, but also community-generated information, the studies that are done by the migrant workers themselves, the surveys that they did among their community should be respected as precious data for any conversation, any discussion or negotiation on the issue of migrants and migrant rights. This brings into question the issue of how accessible really spaces are for migrants and displaced peoples. There is the reality of shrinking space and closing spaces in intergovernmental platforms and processes amongst civil society organizations, with recent experience of these spaces becoming more restrictive, especially with regional and global meetings going online. The question is, how can we ensure the voice, presence, and actual engagement of grassroots migrants in them? For example, in our conversation with migrant workers, during all these online initiatives, online engagements, the question of access to internet, we sometimes take that for granted. That we have that because we think that migrants, because they live in developed countries where internet speed are monsters, we thought that they could access that, but actually they can't. They have very limited access to internet. They have to spend for their own connections, and thus they have to prioritize on what use is the connection for them, whether it's for their family, or are they going to attend seminars or webinars or even online engagements that intergovernmental organizations are conducting right now. Next slide, please. No, sorry, the number 2. The second point is that effective engagement is hinged on a strong grassroots migrant movement in all levels. It must be stressed that any instrument that may be beneficial that comes out of intergovernmental spaces are not given on a silver platter. They are preceded by years and countless sacrifices of those whom the instruments are geared for. Though they are pushed and lobbied inside hallowed meeting halls, they are based on, they stemmed from, and they are directed to those who are on the ground, who experience the everyday issues. Thus, the success and sustaining successes in engagement is dependent on how those on the ground are fighting for their rights and are sustaining their fight through their own led strong movements. So engagements in intergovernmental spaces do not really happen in a vacuum. For example, in the current GCM, many civil society organizations are posting the question on how civil society, and particularly the grassroots migrants, will be able to access the review process that will be happening in the region, and in 2022 is on the international level. Next slide, please. The third point is that if that is the role of the migrants, if that is the place of the migrants themselves, how about the advocates? Advocates are enablers of migrants' participation. We have to also recognize the reality that advocates are usually the ones who have access to information, and they are usually very active in generating also information. They're also the ones who are familiar in navigating processes. They could follow all meetings. They could be in all meetings. They know the ins and outs of negotiations. And that is something that advocates should be able to share to migrants in order to continue their capacitation, increase their capacity for their own engagement. And of course, advocates can generate resources for migrants' participation. We have to also take note that, for example, our experience with NE's participation in the UN summit in 2016, it really required a lot of supporters, even inside UN offices, to push for a grassroots migrant to be able to speak in front of the UN representatives of governments and speak about their own condition and speak about their own perspectives. And for the last slide, the fourth point, is that it is also important to build the solidarity of migrants with other sectors. As engagements do not exist in a vacuum, migrants also do not exist in a vacuum. And building solidarity, especially in the national level, is very important, especially between migrant workers and local workers. The development of supporters who can do crisis response to social advocacy, or combating negative thoughts, negative thinking, negative biases against migrants, or to the policy advocacy. And building solidarity with other sectors would also put migration as a cross-cutting theme and concern of other sectors or other stakeholders. We believe that these are some of the main points that we must consider whenever we engage in intergovernmental processes and we are carrying concerns, issues of migrants in general and climate migrants in particular. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. You are right on time. Thanks for finishing your presentation in time. And now I thank all the panelists for their presentations. We will now take some of the questions. And my first question is for Annie. Uh, any one of the participants from Bangladesh has asked that the problems and issues and difficulties of climate migrants are much more than others, and hence they need some kind of special precautions. What, in your opinion, are the special precautions one can take in case of climate migrants? Anyway.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Actually, honestly, since the COVID-19 all the way to now, we can say around 7 to 8 months, we have been really trying to understand what is really happening day to day. You know, for example, in many countries, they've been declaring lockdown, they've been saying first wave, second wave, even third wave. So everything is really up and down. But now it's already September, and it seems that the COVID-19 is not going to be gone very soon. And that really affects our livelihood, our safety, our welfare. Many migrants are getting depressed. And then yet step by step or slowly, there are a huge number of deportation, you know, by force or by slowly means, you know, like Malaysia, they really arrest and send back home, but many countries try to do it in the soft way, so it doesn't attract social issues. So practically migrants, we can say, we try to survive. If we have good companies, we have good employers, we have good sponsor, try to stay. But then if they also lose the job, if they also close down, then there is nothing we can really do. And while this government where we are staying at this point are not really favorable for migrants to even look for another employment, even find a way how to stay. So many of us during the COVID-19, the number of people who become undocumented is actually increased. People who become living in hunger are actually increasing. In International Migrants Alliance, we have been trying to mobilize different network supporters who can provide from rice to vegetable to mask to sanitizer. So we can say that we are really in desperate situation now. But the question is, can we stay? Do we really have an option to stay? We try, but if we can't, then the most possibility is we will be returning home. Now, another problem we face, there is no job in our home countries, and yet our own government do not provide any cash subsidy for deported migrant. All the way up to now, I cannot say there is now no government who provide cash for us. So it's become a double pressure for the migrants. So in terms of precaution, what we can really call for today, our call today is defend what we have now. As much as possible in host countries, defend. Organization must be very active, must be very critical. We have now, we have to expand our work with the local community to get their solidarity and support in time of crisis like this, because they are now become our last safeguard. You know, when the government are attacking us, the political parties are attacking us, there is every time there is election, then suddenly migrants are the scapegoat for anything. So we need the local to speak out for us, because now we are really, really voiceless. But in the long run, I can say maybe 1, even 2 years to come, when no one can guarantee we would be able to work in the long run in that particular countries, then our advocacy is really pressuring our own government, give a subsidy in cash for migrants who are being deported, regardless of their immigration status. But the second is really ensure to create a job that will provide us income, because there is no guarantee that after 1 or 2 years, there will be an employment abroad.
Thank you, Annie. Now I will refer a question to Pia Oberoi. Pia, the climate migration and the climate migrants' rights are, it seems, underrepresented in the GCM. And how do we step up the advocacy, and how can we optimize the GCM review process? You already mentioned in your presentation that next year in the March, we already have a review of the implementation. Asia Pacific review of the implementation. So how concretely do you, if you have some concrete and specific suggestions, you already have given some suggestions, but can you elaborate a little bit on that? Pia.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vinod. As I mentioned, the review meeting itself, the intergovernmental meeting, will be held between the 10th and the 12th of March next year. And leading up to that, there will be a series of stakeholder consultations, as well, obviously, as the participation of CSOs and stakeholders in the actual review meeting itself. So I would encourage the participants to become involved in that process. There's also each government in the Asia Pacific region has been asked to fill a questionnaire, voluntary questionnaire relating to its implementation of the Global Compact for Migration, where obviously climate issues are mentioned as well under objectives 2 and 5, but also 7, etc., as I've talked about. And it would be important as well for CSOs and stakeholders within the context of their government national review to maybe start a conversation or have a conversation with their governments on that. I mean, I think that if I may be allowed a slight kind of broader picture, the issue that the GCM provides an opportunity. It's not going to provide the answer, in the sense it's a non-binding framework. It's not a legal obligation for states, but it does kind of open a little bit of space. And I would argue that listening as well to the other panelists, the space that needs to be seized from the grassroots is a reimagining of mobility. And that's precisely where the GCM kind of started. The idea that migration governance wasn't working, and it wasn't working for migrants, and we need to do something different. When you hear about the models of labor migration, for instance, because climate migration, as Eni and Harjeet and others have already told us, is already happening. Yes, the Pacific Islands states may be disappearing. There's a very strong concern in relation to sea level rise, but people are moving already. And I think that the kinds of movement that people are being kind of compelled to take in our region is concerning. That we have these structural ways of making people move in the temporary, flexible, fragile, kind of ways. And I feel that this is what civil society should really be addressing, is how to reimagine mobility in the context both of climate change as we see through the pandemic's lens.
Thank you, Pia. And my next question is for Aaron. Aaron, you have already mentioned in your presentation, but there is one question which has come, that what could be a good mechanism of host governments to adopt for promoting and enhancing social protection for migrants? Should they mobilize a program or action group for this, or how will they make this sustainable without compromising the needs of its local population, especially in terms of funds? Aaron.
Thank you very much, Vinod. Thank you for that question. It's a tough question, actually, with regards to social protection. It's a very serious discussion right now, especially with the COVID pandemic. But I would say that for the host government, when it comes to mechanism, there might not be one size fits all mechanism, but there are, I guess, commonality that must be considered. And I guess one of it is really, sorry, there's a need to change, to have a shift in paradigm with regards to migration and how host governments consider migrants. The problem for us, the problem is that migrants for a long time up to now they are not considered as part of society and as contributing to the society. Which is very, very not true, of course. So when it comes to social protection, the question is migrants. The question is not whether migrants have a right to self-protection, because they do. Why? Because they build the society. They are part of the society. They are part even of the funds. The funds that are now being used for social protection are also generated from the work of the migrant workers. Because if they do not work, that's the thing. That's a sort of bias also that we are also trying to address, even in host countries, that migrants are like freeloaders for social protection. No, they work for it. No migrant worker would go to another country just to not work. They go there to work. And if they are working, then they are contributing, and therefore they are entitled to social protection, which is very, in many countries, is not available because of the consideration of migrants as not part of the society, as not part of the permanent residents. Many of the migrant workers have been working and living in many countries, and they still remain to be second-class, third-class citizens. Like, for example, the domestic workers in Hong Kong, who, like, for the past months, the Hong Kong government has offered subsidies to everyone except for the domestic workers. That's the thing, except for the domestic workers, which are considered as a separate category, even from among the migrant workers, the general foreign workers in Hong Kong. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. And the next question is for Harjeet. Harjeet, are there any programs or good practices other countries have for the climate migrants that you can share from, and which other countries can learn from? This is a question from Benilde in the Philippines. Harjeet.
Sure. Unfortunately, there are not many policies that we can refer to, but governments are beginning to take notice. And I think when we talk of migration, and I picking up from what Aaron and Pia said, we need to really reimagine and relook at how we have defined migration. If I talk about many development policies, that unfortunately have been pushed by World Banks and these multilateral banks on how they have actually structurally driven migration from rural to urban areas because they needed more work in the industries, but without offering any social protection and without looking at what we are doing to the rural economy. Only now we have begun to understand the role of migrants, as Aaron said, how they contribute to the economy and how they need to then have access to social protection schemes. Let me pick up an example from India. After, in fact, the movements and CSOs have long been talking about portability of what we have, a ration card, so that which is basically a card to access subsidized food. Now that, imagine for a migrant who has come to a city, cannot access that food. And if you have that portability, then and now with technology, it is very much possible that if you want subsidized food and if you have already left your village, you should be able to access that in the city that you live in. Now that demand has been there for a very long time, but then after COVID, people have realized that no, this has to move up to the political agenda, and government in India has started talking about it. Similarly, the ID card is such an important thing for a migrant to have access to banking services, to get many other benefits that are related to identity. So many of these things have not been there, and we need to really start looking at the journey of a migrant from source to destination, and then pick up some of these examples which can offer a range of basic services and protections that are required for any human being, and start treating them as human beings and start respecting human right of migrant. So as I said, there is some thinking that already exists for, which has been offered by civil society organizations that have been working particularly with urban migrants. But only now it is moving up to the agenda. And of course, there's a huge gap when it comes to migrants who cross borders. As I said earlier, there are no regional and international frameworks. I can see chat talking about what we can do in ASEAN. There are some regional cooperation bodies which are ahead than others. But still, I really cannot see any specific example. Even, in fact, things are much more bad in Europe, as we know what's being done to migrants as we speak. It's already in the news. What's happening in Greece. So really, and I would underline what Pia said, we need to really reimagine how we look at migrants and how we protect their human rights.
Thank you, Harjeet. And my next question is for Lestari. There is a question on the gender gap. Women migrants face more issues than men, such as health, pregnancy, privacy issues. How we can address gender gap issues when it comes to climate-induced migrants?
I think learning from the temporary migrants in Asia, majority of migration is really women, and then many of us are working in the domestic work, caregiver, and other service industry. But the domestic work and caregiver are really the biggest sector for women migrants in Asia. So, and one of the pre-existing campaign that we have even before COVID-19 is really a campaign for the government to regulate the working condition, the working hours, the the accommodation, the food, because now most government in Asia are forcing a woman, a domestic worker, woman caregiver to live in the employer house, in the elderly home, and so forth. And consequently, many of us are suffering from very long working hours, 16 to 20 hours a day, and not adequate food, but even accommodation is very improper. That actually impact a lot to our health. As you know, women have extra need for, whenever every month we have to have menstruation, and then we need longer rest, we need proper food. Otherwise, our body will be deteriorating. And that's why our pre-existing campaign before and during this COVID-19 as pushing government to really come up with working hours regulation, or maybe at least resting hours regulation. If there is no working hours, then make a resting hours, at least 10 to 11 hours a day that we should be allowed to rest, including 8 hours of sleeping. And then plus of that is regulation on food. That's very important, because as for now, food is just depends to the kindness of the employer. But beyond that, when it comes to safe repatriation, we also want the government to ensure that women should be prioritized. They should be ensured to go home safely very soon, so their health while they are staying in temporary accommodation will not be jeopardized. So there are a lot of campaigns that we are doing in that aspect, but really I agree with Pia, that our issues are really pre-existing issues that we have to continue to advocate even during this COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. There's one more question which has come on ASEAN. In ASEAN, we must have a holistic regional approach by adopting the ICPRM. And maybe the GCM can be a starter in the ASEAN region too. I will ask Pia if she can give her impression on this process and how can we do that. Thank you, Pia.
Thanks, Vinod. Very quickly, because I'm not an expert on ASEAN, but as we know, there are a number of mechanisms that have been activated under ASEAN, such as the human mechanism on human rights, but also the consensus and the ASEAN Migrant Labour Forum. So we have, probably more than, for instance, in other subregions like South Asia, we probably have a little bit more kind of thing together. But if I understand right, there's also, kind of a link to, well, would ASEAN be able to kickstart a movement to ratification of the Migrant Workers Convention, which is obviously the UN Convention on Migrant Workers. And that may well be, one of the consequences. It's been a very slow road to get to the ASEAN consensus, etc. But it may well be. They understand that, labor rights of migrants are important. But what I would say is that there's no reason to wait for the ratification of the Migrant Workers Convention. And I say that because Asia as a region is not comfortable, is not historically kind of the leader on ratification of international instruments. So we can't wait till all the instruments are ratified to be able to uphold member states to their obligations. Every country in this region in ASEAN is a signatory to the Child Rights Convention, for instance. There's a large number of signatories to the the ICCPR, the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is really important in terms of the right to work. So we have a body of law that is already there, and those parts of civil society that are kind of comfortable working with legal standards can pick these up and approach the courts and approach the judiciary and build the capacity of their governments to understand their obligations. So I think that this is important to know, is that we don't need to wait for something to happen. ASEAN, most of the member states of ASEAN are great fans of the GCM. Thailand is a champion, Indonesia is a champion, Bangladesh outside of ASEAN is a champion country, but some of them are not. Malaysia and Singapore are very opposed to the GCM, so we mustn't wait. As Harjeet said, there's few things that need legal precision, such as when somebody crosses an international border, are they entitled to protection from return? that is something that does need, kind of a new answer. But otherwise, we have the standards there, and really, it's up to civil society, as Aaron was saying, it's really up to civil society to build that momentum from the ground up.
Thank you, and this is my next question is for Aaron again. You have already mentioned lots of points, but just bullet points or the power points we want to know from you again on how do we help strengthen the migrants movement to effectively campaign for the rights of the climate migrants. So it's a kind of opportunity for you to sum up what you have already mentioned.
Okay.
Bullet points,
okay. Okay, I'll try to do that summing up. Yeah, thank you. I think, the issue of how to help strengthen migrants movement. Helping strengthen migrants movement is to actually help them strengthen the migrant movement themselves. It is not it is not primarily what we know. It is really more of what migrants know. It is more of how migrants themselves appreciate what we know. So I guess concretely as a sort of recommendation to strengthen the climate migrants' rights campaign, I think the first one is we really need to facilitate the connections and solidarity among climate migrants and other displaced peoples. We must ensure that the climate migrants' concerns is not siloed on the climate migrants alone, because we know that climate change is not only about climate change being a driver of migration. Climate change also perpetuates the continued displacement of migrants, even some migrants who were not displaced by climate change, but they are forced to continue to become migrants because the sudden onset or slow onset impact of climate change in their countries make them vulnerable in their home countries, and thus they are forced to stay overseas. So we have to make that kind of connection with them in order to build that movement. And of course, we know that we have to conduct education on how the climate crisis impacts all, and we have to really build the issue of climate migrants and migration itself as a cross-sectoral, cross-country, and cross-regional issue, and thus requires such form of solidarity as well. Thank
you. I think we will kind of try to conclude this dialogue on the notion of solidarity and solidarity from below. And I thank all the panelists for their very useful, concrete, and solid suggestions and views how we can all collaborate, how we can all create a kind of pressure on our respective governments to make a case for the climate migrants. Today's discussion and dialogue, one of the key point was the participation and the suggestions and interaction by the participants. I thank them all. Some of the points which I have noted, and we would definitely dwell upon them, and we'll try to bring out a document which we will share with you as well. Some of the main points, if I can make an attempt to summarize with the help of our team, are that GCM is an opportunity for us, before us, to open discussions and engagements on the issues raised by the migrants. They provide us the platform to do that, and it depends upon how much prepared we are to take this forward. The challenge remains is the treatment of the host country governments of migrants as those excluded from policies and programs. Hence, they even are excluded from basic services such as health and social protection schemes. We need to recognize the rights and contributions of migrants and develop ways so that they can access social protection. There are no international regional frameworks so as to ensure overall protection of the human rights of migrants. We need to reimagine ways to push forward to advance human rights of the migrants, and if we are able to concretize this, we will be able to address the challenges confronting climate migrants. The issues of migrants are already pre-existing, and these are the issues we need to continue advocating even in the time of pandemic. And there is no reason or way for the ratification of the ICPRM to hold member states accountable to the convention. There are existing conventions in which states are signatories already. We can pick up these conventions and raise the issues to advocate to the governments about their responsibilities. And it is up to the civil society to build up that momentum from the ground. This is also what Arles has a strong conviction and belief that we need to build up the solidarities. We need to build up, combine our strengths and our struggles between the global north and global south. We need to create a we need to put power into the people's hand. And with this people's mobilization and with all our collaboration only, we can get to a situation where all our demands and all our needs are heard of properly. I finally, since next year we have a pretext that next year there is going to be a Asia Pacific review for the GCM, and Pia has already provided us very nice inputs. Harjeet has also shared his experience, and I'm sure with Annie and Aaron, with their vast experience and their experience and their struggles and fighting with the people on the street, we will be able to formulate concrete ideas. How do we engage with this process which lies ahead, which will be, in our opinion, would be a good step forward. And so here are the main points. And before I ask Laura to kind of give a closing remarks, I would request Tetet, Ray, and Roy to switch on their cameras. Tetet, Ray, and Roy were the main persons behind this online dialogue. They worked much more, and since beginning to make this dialogue a success. And many of you would already know Tetet and would have met her in the front line of most of the climate justice movements and struggles. I salute her the way she has organized and coordinated this dialogue. And thanks to Ray from International Migrant Alliance for being there always with us, with his crisp and sharp inputs. And most important of all, thanks to Roy for providing us this technical expertise and to handle this webinar, this online dialogue in the most efficient manner. Ray conveys his sorry that he doesn't have Ron says that he doesn't have a camera. He's working on a personal computer desktop. So anyways, next time we'll definitely request Ray to arrange a camera for yourself. And now I ask Laura to give her closing remarks. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Vinod. You already mentioned quite a few things how to move forward, which I would have mentioned in the closing notes. So to be more concrete, we will continue with this dialogue series. We will hold also webinars for Latin America and Africa. As Vinod mentioned, we will produce that outcome report from these dialogues, and this will be the basis for a submission for the Global Compact Migration Review process. And as Aaron mentioned, these direct voices from the climate migrants through, for example, community reports, these should be a strong part of these submissions. So if you're interested, and that's a call to all the participants, if you're interested to collaborate on that with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for the outcome report and the submission, please get back to us. via email. So we really hope to create that pressure and advocate for climate migrants' rights by compiling these various voices and using these legal mechanisms to the maximum extent which are already in place. And as Pia said, this is an opening window we should use. So also from my side, thanks everyone, thanks the panelists, the participants, and the great team, as we not mentioned, who made that first dialogue really possible and impactful. Looking forward to the next steps, and hopefully you join us also for the next webinars. Thank you very much.